All right. Be sure to take notes as you watch this video and do the reading that is assigned for tonight as well. First, I want to talk about the concept of a niche. Basically, what a niche is it's the unique living arrangements of a species. So you can think of it as that species lifestyle or that species job. So it might include things like their habitat or where they live, their food source or their required nutrients, the time of day they're active, their nest sites, maybe other things like how big their territory is. So you can think of all sorts of other things that might be really important for a particular species to survive. Now, one thing that can happen is more than one species can have similar niches. And when niches overlap, we get competition. And I believe we've already talked about different kinds of competition. So we can have interspecific and intraspecific competition. So you might just pause the video right here and look back in your notes to remember which is which. Now, what can happen is when we have competition between two species, that might lead to competitive exclusion, where one species is actually a much better competitor than the other and completely excludes the weaker or less competitive species from the entire ecosystem. One thing that can occur as well is called resource partitioning. This is where the two species actually evolve to use different aspects of the habitat or of the ecosystem to reduce competition. So an example of this is with warblers, and warblers are a type of songbird, a small bird, and there are a lot of different species, and oftentimes they're living in the same areas, but they've evolved to use different parts of a tree for feeding. So some will hang out in the very tops of the trees and eat the insects up there. Some will hang out more in the middle of the trees. Others will be in the lower parts of the trees and may even go down to the ground to grab some food. And that way they're not competing for the same resources. Other types of interactions that we see between species, now competition is the most common, but there are definitely other ones like predation, where we have a predator that's feeding on its prey. Herbivory we can think of as a special type of predation where we have an organism eating plant or algae. There are also symbiotic relationships, which are really, really close relationships, or oftentimes one species actually can't survive without the other. So one example is parasitism. So in parasitism, one organism is benefiting while the other is not. It's actually being harmed. Now, it's different than predation. In predation, the predator actually kills its prey. In parasitism, the predator may, or the parasite may weaken its host, but it's not going to actually kill it off, at least not quickly, because then it would have to go find a new host, and that would be sort of a pain. Mutualism is another type of symbiotic relationship where both members of the relationship actually benefit from one another. And then finally, commensalism is a type of symbiotic relationship where one species benefits, but the other doesn't benefit. It also isn't harmed. It's just sort of neutral. So I've put some examples in the video, but you might just pause it here and think about some other examples of all of these different types of interactions, and I'll have you share those in class. One type of species is called a keystone species. And what a keystone species is, it's a species that has a really large effect on the ecosystem, and a larger effect than you would expect for the number of individuals there are. So when the numbers or the population size of a keystone species changes, it actually causes huge changes in the entire community structure. So an example of a keystone species is a sea otter. So sea otters, their favorite foods are sea urchins, which we can see here. Sea urchins eat kelp, and kelp is really important because it provides a really cool sort of underwater forest that a lot of organisms use for habitat. So what do you think will happen if killer whales eat all the sea otters? So that would mean we have fewer sea otters, and I'll let you think about what would happen to the entire ecosystem. We'll talk about that more in class. I want to switch gears a little bit here to talk about energy and nutrients in ecosystems. So one really important thing to remember is energy flows through ecosystems. There is an input, it goes through the ecosystem, and it leaves that ecosystem. Nutrients, on the other hand, things like carbon and oxygen and water, are recycled. They cycle through the ecosystem, and they don't really leave. Now, they might leave one ecosystem and go to the next, but they're not like leaving Earth. So think about it. What is the ultimate source of energy on Earth? Hopefully you came up with the sun. Nearly all the energy on Earth comes from the sun. A little bit comes from heat within the Earth, but almost all organisms get their energy ultimately from the sun. So how do we gain access to that energy? We have talked about this before. Basically, we don't photosynthesize, but on Earth we gain access to that light energy through the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is done by producers, things like plants and algae. There are also types of bacteria called cyanobacteria that can photosynthesize, and they were the first organisms on Earth that could photosynthesize. Another term for producers, or things that can do photosynthesis, is called an autotroph, and they're autotrophs because they're producing their own food. So just you might remind yourself what photosynthesis is and what the equation for that is. You will be expected to remember that. Energy actually flows through communities through different trophic levels. So producers are the ones that are actually capturing that sun energy and changing it into chemical energy or into sugars and carbohydrates through photosynthesis. Then primary consumers are going to be eating producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. So the energy, it starts off in the producers, and it's going to flow through these different levels, and these levels we call trophic levels. So primary consumers are the things that are eating the producers. We also call them herbivores. They're heterotrophic because they have to eat. They're not making their own food. And like I said, they're feeding on producers. So here are some examples of different types of primary consumers. Now you might say, well, aren't there instances where maybe a mouse might eat an insect? Well, sure. So sometimes organisms might actually exist on multiple trophic levels, and that's fine. Higher level consumers, we consider these carnivores because they're eating other animals or other consumers. They're also heterotrophic because they are eating. Secondary consumers are going to feed mostly on primary consumers, so they're going to feed on herbivores. Tertiary consumers are one level up. They're going to be eating secondary consumers, so they're going to be eating other meat eaters. So some examples here of secondary and tertiary consumers: a frog that maybe eats a grasshopper that's eating a plant would be a secondary consumer. A polar bear that's eating a seal, and that seal might eat fish, and that fish might be eating smaller fish, which maybe are eating plankton. That would definitely be a tertiary consumer. Killer whale, same thing. They might be eating sea otters, which then it would be a secondary consumer, but maybe they're also eating seals. So we can draw food webs and food chains to depict the way the energy is flowing. When we draw these, we're always going to draw the arrow in the direction that the energy is flowing. So if a mouse eats a rat, the energy is actually flowing from the rat to the mouse or to the snake. So we'll draw the arrow that direction. Food webs just show interconnected food chains. So they tend to be a lot more complicated than just a simple food chain, but they're a lot more realistic for what's actually going on in the ecosystem. So here is a food chain that does involve a rat and a snake, but there's a lot more to it. I mentioned this before that some animals do function at different trophic levels. A great example of this would be an omnivore. So an omnivore can function as a primary consumer, eating plant or algae material, but may also eat other consumers, and so may also be basically a meat eater or carnivore sometimes, so it does double duty. One thing that's often not depicted on food webs is those organisms that are getting rid of the dead stuff. So detritus feeders feed on dead stuff and other wastes. They're able to extract some energy from that dead stuff. And we typically call these things like scavengers, such as that turkey vulture we see up here. Decomposers are a little bit different. They're also going to be feeding on dead stuff, but they're going to be doing extracellular digestion. They basically secrete digestive enzymes outside their cells, break down the food, and then absorb the molecules that they need. And they're able to actually break down organic matter and break down the molecules into a sort of non-organic form, into a very basic form that detritus feeders and other consumers can't do. So it basically recycles those nutrients back to the atmosphere, back to the soil, and back to the water so that plants can uptake those nutrients. Maybe it's putting nitrogen back into the air, which is a much more complicated process to get that back into the soil. But again, those molecules are highly changing in a way that other consumers can't do that. And the only decomposers on Earth are bacteria and fungi. Energy transfer is actually really inefficient, and we'll talk more about this in class, but in every step that energy goes through a trophic level, so from the sun to producers, and producers to the different levels of consumers, and then finally to scavengers and decomposers, energy is actually lost. And it's not completely like lost, poof, it goes away. It's just the useful energy becomes non-useful heat. We don't actually get energy in terms of like calories and stuff through heat. So we can't use that energy anymore. The nutrients, on the other hand, the molecules and the atoms like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, those just get recycled. They keep going. They're not going away. They might go into the earth, into the atmosphere, into the water, but we can use them over and over. So only about 10% of energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to the next. So that means that 90% of the energy is actually lost or just used by that organism. So as I'm talking right now, I'm using energy. I'm actually warm, 98.6 degrees. So I'm putting off that heat. I'm not actually using it. But as I'm moving my muscles, I'm also using up some of that energy just to contract my muscles. So if I have an ecosystem here and the producers contain about 10,000 kilocalories of energy, if only 10% of the energy just gets transferred to primary consumers, how much energy is available at the primary consumer level? Hopefully you came up with 1,000. So if we have 1,000 kilocalories at the primary consumer level, how many get transferred up to the secondary consumers? And that's 100 kilocalories. And then finally, how much available is going to be, or how much energy is going to be available to the tertiary consumers? And we get only 10 kilocalories. So we'll talk more about this next class. If you have questions, make sure that you write those down and look them up in your book or ask them in class next time I see you.